This video is accurate as of January 6th, 2022. However, the situation is still developing. I will be updating the pinned comment of this video as we get new information, so please make sure to check that out as well before spreading any information presented in this video or commenting below. Alright, let's try this again. Now, as you may or may not be aware, miHoYo has recently announced some design changes to some certain characters. Currently, this list only includes 4 characters: Jean, Amber, Rosaria, and Mona. These 4 characters will be receiving new default designs. However, these designs come with a little bit of a caveat, and it's generated a lot of concern. I'm here hoping to put some of those concerns to rest and to also give you a better understanding about what actually is going on and what it means going forward. But to do that, we need a little bit of context surrounding how Genshin works and how miHoYo operates in the grand scheme of things. So let's start by talking about the servers. Now, everyone who plays Genshin knows that Genshin has multiple servers depending on whatever region you live in. It's the server that you play on, right? If you live in North America, you play on North America server. Well, at least you're supposed to. Not everyone does, but that's how it's supposed to work. Anyway, once you've selected a server, you cannot change it. That is the server for your account, period. End of story. However, the server system is actually not just these individual servers, but they're 2 clusters of servers split into 2 groups. There's 1 cluster for global and 1 cluster for China. These are 2 very different server groups, and they actually run 2 different builds of the game. The builds themselves are very similar, but there are some subtle differences between them, and those differences may or may not increase over time, depending on any number of factors that we'll just not focus on right now. So the reason for these 2 different builds has to do with how China regulates and distributes video game content. I will not be elaborating on this process as a whole, as it's really not my place to do so, as I don't really understand it all that well to be considered, like a real reliable source on it. So for the purpose of this discussion, all you really need to know is that everything that gets published in China has to go through a sort of review process and can only be published after it has been approved. This only applies to content that is distributed in China, and it does not apply to any content that is distributed outside of China, hence why there are 2 versions, one for China and one for global. In the context of these new character designs, we get 2 different executions of these designs, let's just say. So if you are a player on the global server, the new character designs that were announced will be released as default skin options that you can toggle on and off as will. Again, they're just skins. Now, as far as we're aware, these skins are free, and they're not really like the alternate costumes like, Ningguang and Keqing are getting for the Lantern, right? They're, alternate default costumes, so they're not, special edition or whatever. This could change, just saying, but it is unlikely. Now, if you play on China servers, it's a little bit different. These aren't really skins necessarily, but new default character design. So like pre-rendered cutscenes will feature them and so on and so forth. You may have seen images like this floating around, and yes, this is real and it is currently live on the Chinese servers. From what I understand, these kind of weird altered designs are only temporary adjustments to the current character models and will ultimately be replaced by the new designs when they have been finished. That said, this is also subject to change, and it's very possible that Chinese players could have the option to toggle between these 2 as well, but it will still not be the original designs, but the altered version of the original designs. Chinese players will also receive 1,200 Primo Gems as compensation for this change, while global players will not, because they don't really need compensation because this is a toggleable option and it's like a bonus, so it's like a free thing, so you don't need any Primos. So rip people who wanted the Primos, I guess? Now, the real question everyone wants to know the answer to is, why is this happening? How did it go down? What's the deal? Before I try to answer that, I want to reiterate one more time that this is a developing situation and that this explanation is subject to change. But here's how I've come to understand it. In China, Genshin Impact is rated for ages 12 and up. If you're familiar with any rating system, you will know that every rating system has its own list of restrictions and types of content that it is considered acceptable and not acceptable to have. Full disclosure, I do not know what is included on this list for the 12 and up in China, and I barely understand the American age rating systems because they're so malleable and they vary so much. But anyway, in light of the game's age rating, a feminist group who believed that Genshin was presenting women in a way that was inappropriate essentially reported MiHoYo, and under pressure, MiHoYo decided to make some adjustments to the character models immediately and then also provide redesigned characters to have more cohesive and, I guess, age-appropriate outfits? Is not really a good way to word that. I do want to emphasize here that I have incorrectly stated in other places that this was something that came about as per governmental regulations, and that is not exactly the case, as this feminist group doesn't technically have any political leverage. The situation is actually incredibly nuanced and is a separate issue entirely from censorship at a government level. This does not mean that censorship does not occur at the governmental level, it just means that in this particular instance, that's not where the problem originated. I could spend some time elaborating on this particular situation, but I don't believe I'm the best person to do that. So instead, I will be providing some resources in the description as I locate them, and in the pinned comment for further reading if you are curious about the details. But regardless of those details, here are a few things to be aware of in the context of this game's future, and really in the context of MiHoYo's future. But as I say this, I am not doom posting, okay? This isn't a doom post video thing. I'm only looking to explore some possibilities in order to help everyone maintain realistic expectations going forward and how certain issues might develop. And heavy emphasis on the might, okay? First, I want to clarify that this is not an isolated incident and that Genshin itself is not the only target of groups such as this one. This sort of thing has happened many times before with many games that are sold in China and will likely continue to happen over and over and over again. Some games respond to this kind of pressure by removing the offending topics or characters from the game entirely. Imagine that. MiHoYo will not do that, okay? So please don't freak out about that. What appears to be more common is for games to release two different versions, one for the Chinese player base and one for global. MiHoYo has already technically done this, although their two versions are incredibly similar currently. Now, when there are two different versions of the game, that means that there are more than just tiny differences between said versions, but on the whole, it does appear that most of the changes that happen within these versions tend to err on the cosmetic side of things. Whether that means removing graphical depictions of blood and replacing it with, like blue fireworks or whatever, or, changing animations like idle animations, or like in this case, giving characters completely different skins. Sometimes different wording is provided for dialogue, and sometimes certain words are removed or replaced with other terms in order to meet the local regulations and expectations, but none of that is new, or unique to China for that matter. What appears to be less likely with games like this is the changing of the entire story, plot, or world building, unless it's like a really blatant representation of China that paints them in a bad light, but in which case it never would have passed the, approval process anyway, so there's that. But a lot of people have just expressed concern that these skins are just the start of a wider-reaching censorship movement. And I'm very confident that this is not the case for right now in this context, okay? Like, that's a whole separate thing. Doesn't really apply here. Could certain things be censored in the future? Yeah, but it wouldn't come from the same place that these current changes came from. I've had a lot of you mention that it felt as though the Inazuma Archon quest was likely so janky because it was probably censored. This is actually a very definite possibility because, as we've mentioned, anything that gets released in China has to be approved before it's published. If, for whatever reason, their original storyline was not approved and they were close to the deadline, then they would have had to scramble to put something together. However, that is actually a completely separate issue from altering the character designs because they originate in two very different places, even theoretically. And even then, I don't think that this will happen again to the story. Inazuma is kind of a unique situation because it was about a resistance militia fighting against an established government, which is a topic that is kind of no bueno in China. In hindsight, no one should have been surprised by this. So ultimately, what's the takeaway here? Well, basically it boils down to this. Global players will get alternate skins for free that they can toggle on and off at will. And Chinese players will be receiving the same character designs, but as their permanent default options, and it is unclear if they will also be keeping the censored versions of the current designs, but it is confirmed that they will be receiving 1200 Primo Gems as compensation for the changes. I also don't think that this is the last batch of characters that will see changes. The feminist group in question has already been rumored to be making a new list of characters to report, so we will probably see this happen to another batch once again. I think the most likely candidates for this change are Fischl, Beidou, and Yanfei, as the three are non-limited characters. I don't think any male characters are at risk here either, because this is specifically pressure put on by a feminist group, and I'm not quite sure what they would do with the men in that. Anyway, it's just those three female characters that I think are mostly at risk, because even though Lisa is kind of, you know, mommy-ish, she's not that provocatively dressed, weirdly enough. She's actually pretty conservatively dressed, so I don't think she'll be next. Also, Beidou, Fischl, and Yanfei are all non-limited characters, and I just don't think any of the limited 5 stars will receive any changes at all in the near future. This is mostly because gambling laws are a real pain to work around, and changing limited characters after they've been released is just like it's a minefield. It's really difficult. Okay, it's just really hard. Even if they put like a lot of pressure on them, it's gonna be a really difficult thing to get changed. Just saying. So, limited 5 stars are probably not gonna have this happen to them. Now, that said, going forward, we are likely to see one of two things happen. Possibility number 1, we will be getting less scantily clad or skimpy or whatever female character designs in future. This is fairly possible just due to the game's rating of being for ages 12 and up in China, and I'm still not clear on what the restrictions are there. But even then, I don't know that it'll be too drastic of a shift in design philosophy. In the case of Shenhe, for example, they basically just removed her belly button to show that the fabric of her outfit isn't sheer, and that's apparently enough to make her whole outfit acceptable. So I guess it depends on what your definition of like scantily clad or whatever the term they want to use here is. Basically what I'm saying is that even though this change is a possibility, you know, the change itself isn't going to be that pronounced going forward. Like, Shenhe still maintains all of her aesthetic without her belly button. It's just so minor. But anyway, a possibility number 2 is that if the initial creative direction for a character errs on the side of too skimpy or scantily clad or whatever the term they want to use is, MiHoYo may opt to make 2 different versions, one to be released on the China servers and one to be released for global. Creating 2 versions of the same character is not a difficult or sufficiently time-consuming task, and if they believe that making an outfit more revealing for a global market will net them more money, then this is actually something we could realistically expect. But that doesn't mean that every character will be released with 2 skins, and we do have to keep in mind that the Chinese player base doesn't really respond all that well when global receives something that they do not. I'll leave some articles about some rather infamous incidents in the description box for you to take a look at to understand what I mean, but I won't be going over it here. Because, just know that it's a little bit more problematic than, you know, screaming at somebody over Twitter. Now, with all that said, I realize that this video is a little bit of a departure from my usual content, and it's not something I tend to cover. This is a game theory channel after all. The misinformation on the internet can spread so fast, and honestly, it can do a lot of damage. While I may not be a very large YouTuber and my area of influence might be rather small, I do feel the need to make what little difference I can where I can, and that starts with making sure that I'm providing everyone who watches my content with the best information I can possibly give them. And it's not always 100% accurate, because this might come as a surprise to you, but I am only human and I'm also only one person. So there's a limit to what I can do. And while I have an approximate knowledge of a great many things, I am not an expert on any one thing. That's why I go out of my way to try and listen to all of you and read every single comment that you leave, because some of you are far more informed and educated about certain topics than I am. I learn a lot from you guys. So I made this video to ensure that we have some place to start these constructive discussions, and so that we can better understand what's going on around us. Reacting impulsively and getting angry without actually understanding the roots of the situation just benefits nobody, even the people you think you're trying to support. So what I'm asking is to please try and understand the situation from both a global perspective and a business perspective, and the perspective of the Chinese player base, because each perspective has its own nuances. And what miHoYo's done here is found a pretty good way to compromise in a situation that is honestly a little less than ideal for everyone involved. We shouldn't hate on the people who really like the new designs, and we shouldn't hate on the people who don't like the new designs and who want to keep the old ones. We're navigating this situation together. With any luck, little discussions like these can help make a difference to the right people in a small way. So I hope this video was of help to you, and I hope you found this informative. Like I said, I will be updating the pinned comment of this video as I get new information, so please make sure to check that out for the latest details. Thanks again so much for watching, you guys, and I'll catch you next time.